We know that there has been a resounding rhetoric which has concerned the international community coming out of Pyongyang. And so we're going to begin actually by asking John about the current context and thoughts he has on the current security dilemma on the peninsula. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve. Oh, it's a pleasure being here at the Korea side again. To share some thoughts on the current developments on the region, I'd like to contextualize in terms of how I'm seeing some of the trends going on through the lens of new leadership in the region. This is something that is frankly not a surprise. This has been anticipated in terms of change of leadership in all of the countries in the region at approximately the same time period. And I think with that, there is an opportunity to see in some countries a consolidation of power, as we're seeing in North Korea by many accounts, and same in China with a new leadership there. So the power consolidation introduces, I think, interesting elements and ways to look at some of these recent developments. When we zero in specifically on the Korean Peninsula and these almost daily threats coming out of North Korea and reactions through the U.S.-South Korean alliance, by way of last week overflight of B-52 bombers, and most recently B-2 stealth bombers. This is, by many accounts, different from what we've seen in the past. But I think in terms of one type of development that I would zero in on, and emphasizing how it's different, is the way in which North Korea has walked away from these hotlines. There can be an interpretation that is more symbolic to heighten the threat, but in an operational sense, the crisis management capabilities in the room within which the parties can manage crises or potential escalations that do happen, those spaces are drastically reduced when you do have these measures, such as walking away and announcing null and void mechanisms that have in the past been quite pivotal. But the key thing here in all of these developments, I think, is to look very carefully at a new leader in North Korea, who I think from an outsider's perspective is probing the different parties around him in the different countries. So one way that I frame it is almost as if the North Korean leadership in Kim Jong-un is conducting a lot of observations right now. So for each threat, looking at the different reactions and almost jotting those down in a book of flinches to see how these new leadership elements react to these elevation of tensions. I think that's very important operational intelligence for a new structure like the Kim Jong-un leadership, and something that potentially can be configured in certain ways for future interactions later down the road as well.
But it seems, John, that the reaction from the international community, despite the hysteria, as one of the European news services put it out of Pyongyang, has actually been muted, that there's been a very constrained response, certainly on the part of Washington and Seoul. In fact, President Park Geun-hye has actually sent food aid north and has put in some gentle reminders relative to her commitment to trust politique. How do you play that against the expectations of North Korea with this crisis language?
Right. With the crisis language, the big, I would say, marker of the current round of escalation can be traced back to the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 2094. There were reaffirmation of previous measures, but new measures where we saw the designation of North Korean diplomats in terms of some of their money carrying activities and so forth. The reaction from North Korea was quite visceral, but in a macro sense, if you look at what happened, it was the United States and China coordinating very closely in getting that resolution passed. I think for North Korea, that type of cooperation is lethal if it's maintained, because it drastically reduces a space in which it can maneuver and leverage different parties off of each other. One way for North Korea to get that type of cooperation to go by way of heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing is to elevate tensions to the level where the Chinese come in and basically ask all the parties to exercise restraint, backtrack on some of these cooperative areas, and essentially start to get the triggering of criticism from Washington that China is coddling North Korea rather than reining in an ally during a very critical escalation period. The element here that I think we can see in terms of this almost North Korean ratcheting up of tensions and getting type of reaction that would invoke some aspect of a response from China is the U.S. Use of their B-52 bombers last week and their B-2 bombers now. Although those are clearly a message designed for the North Korean regime that the deterrent stance of the United States and North Korea is very strong and something that shouldn't be invoked at any time. So, try to counsel North Korea not to engage in adventurism. For certain elements in China, those types of capabilities right at their doorstep feeds into their existing concerns about containment, that the Asia-Pacific rebalancing is nothing but a formalization of this containment where the U.S., through its friends and allies, is encircling China and preventing its rise. So that's the part where my take on this is that if North Korea were to get that part right, you suddenly have an elevation of tensions to the point where they break that pattern of cooperation between Beijing and Washington.